St. Francisville begins with the story of Bayou Sarah. In the days prior to the invention of the Western River steamboats, folks from the Ohio, Cumberland, and Tennessee valleys were making their way to the port of New Orleans aboard flatboats and keelboats, where they sold products such as furs, buffalo robes, deer skins, bear skins, and grease, and agricultural products such as tobacco, cotton, corn, and hemp. These rivermen found shelter from the swift currents of the Mississippi River at the mouth of a small tributary named Bayou Sarah. From that harborage, a little community popped up that would evolve into a major town and river port. For such a small town, Bayou Sarah was quite cosmopolitan. People of several nationalities made Bayou Sarah their home, but Germans and Jews were most significant in building a town of commerce, marketing, and finance, as well as technical industries that supported the town, such as smithing and carpentry. With the invention of the steamboat, Bayou Sarah, along with Memphis, Vicksburg, Natchez, and Baton Rouge, became major left bank ports of call along the river route to New Orleans. The two main agricultural commodities shipped from Bayou Sarah were sugar and cotton. Coming into the port were consumer products demanded by local people and industrial supplies demanded by craftsmen. And one main product shipped on steamboats from Kentucky was thoroughbred racehorses. Mules for farming were also shipped on the steamboats from Missouri and Tennessee. Bayou Sarah had a mile-long wharf. That's an acronym for warehouses at riverfront. Bayou Sarah had numerous mercantile stores, elegant hotels and saloons, as well as livery stables and blacksmith shops. Bayou Sarah also had a sawmill, where huge virgin cypress were milled into lumber. Bayou Sarah was the terminus for the nation's third oldest railroad. The West Feliciana Railroad connected Bayou Sarah and St. Francisville with Woodville, Mississippi. The trains brought agricultural products from distant farms away from natural transportation routes to the Mississippi River. The West Feliciana Railroad eventually became a spur line of the New Orleans, Jackson, and Great Northern Railroad, which eventually was renamed the Illinois Central. The West Feliciana Railroad was important for moving supplies, horses, and men to Confederate troops during the American Civil War. As long as the Confederates controlled Vicksburg upstream from Bayou Sarah and above the pass to the Red River, and Port Hudson, a few miles south of Bayou Sarah and south of the pass to the Red River, a steamboat supply line was opened from manufacturing and supply centers in northeast Texas right into Bayou Sarah. Bayou Sarah was shelled during the Civil War by the gunboat USS Essex. The town suffered a fire at the beginning of the war that destroyed a good portion of the town, and the town dealt with several floods during its lifetime. With each disaster, people would move up the hill away from the river. Some folks moved their businesses up the hill as well. With each disaster, Bayou Sarah got smaller and St. Francisville got a little larger. In the early 20th century, 3 major floods occurred, giving just enough time between each one to rebuild before the next one occurred. The town was abandoned and the people moved up the hill to St. Francisville. I recently drove to the old ferry landing where Bayou Sarah once stood. It's easy to see why Bayou Sarah no longer exists today. The first historic settlements in the vicinity of St. Francisville were Houma and Tunica Indian villages. When the French claimed all of the Mississippi River Valley from the Appalachians to the Rocky Mountains, Métis trade agents were sent to live among the tribes, and at many villages forts were built that served as trading posts. Near the location of St. Francisville, Fort Rain a Tunicus was established in 1729. With the settling of the French-Indian War in 1763, Spain was ceded all of Louisiana west of the Mississippi River, plus the Ile d'Orléans, where New Orleans is located. The British were ceded all of Florida from Spain up to the Mississippi River. Also, as part of the Treaty of Paris, French allied Indian tribes were to fall under the protection of Spain. The Tunicas and the Homas moved west along with numerous other tribes, and the Tunicas ended up near Marksville, Louisiana. The Spanish were looking for an opportunity to reclaim Florida, their former colony, from the British. They found the opportunity in 1779 when Spain joined in an alliance with the American patriots against the British in the War for American Independence. Britain was at war, and the forts on the Mississippi were distant from Britain's main army on the Atlantic seaboard. Moving a large army by ships would be difficult, for Spain controlled both the Florida Straits and the entrance to the Mississippi. In 1780, Bernardo Galvez led a campaign along the lower Mississippi that resulted in a victory with the siege at Fort New Richmond at Baton Rouge against a British force of over 400 regulars and 150 militiamen. The terms of the surrender included the surrender of all British forts along the Mississippi. Florida, from Bayou Manchac to Natchez and eastward to the Perdido River, became West Florida. Terms of surrender to end the American Revolution included all of Florida returning to the Spanish. Spain had so many colonies for settlers to choose from in regions that had very pleasant climates that it was difficult to find Spanish colonists for the Gulf Coast colonies of Texas, Louisiana, and Florida. The British began occupying Florida after the French Indian War. American colonists who were neutral moved in during the American Revolution, and British loyalists moved in after the Revolution. The Spanish were governing a French population in Louisiana and an English population in West Florida. In 1803, Louisiana was purchased from Napoleon, who had acquired it through a war with Spain. Napoleon never occupied Louisiana, and under law set by the treaty, Spain was supposed to have the first option to receive the territory if France should give it up. In 1810, the British settlers in West Florida rose up against the Spanish. Philemon Thomas planned and led an attack against the Spanish garrison at Fort San Carlos near Baton Rouge. After expelling the Spanish, the revolutionaries established a constitution, designed a blue flag with a single white star in the middle, and for 2.5 months, St. Francisville became the national capital of the free and independent Lone Star Republic of West Florida. The United States wanted complete control of both banks of the Mississippi. Upon receiving Louisiana Governor William C.C. Claiborne's report of the rebellion, President James Madison ordered Claiborne to send troops to St. Francisville and annex the region before the Spanish returned with an overwhelming force. The western part of the Lone Star Republic of West Florida became the top of the foot in the boot-shaped map of the state of Louisiana. The flag of West Florida became known as the Bonnie Blue flag. The Bonnie Blue was used by Texans before their unique Lone Star flag was designed. In the American Civil War, the Bonnie Blue became representative of states' rights and is still commonly identified with the Confederacy to this day. St. Francisville sits atop a lowest bluff. During the Pleistocene period, glaciers were melting and flooding the alluvial floodplains of the Mississippi Valley, dumping large amounts of silt across the valley. As the waters receded and the silt dried, winds from a westerly direction picked up the silt and carried it across the Mississippi River to the east. Once the silt hit barriers, such as hills and vegetation, the silt accumulated into massive dunes. Soil scientists name this silt-rich soil loess. Some geographers refer to it as loess. The silt particle is powder dry with little to no stickiness, and when a particle doesn't stick easy, it erodes easy. Loess is very rich and easy to plow, but it washes away a little at a time with every rain. St. Francisville sits on a finger ridge between two deep ravines. St. Francisville is described as being 2 miles long and 2 yards wide. Near the end of the finger ridge reaching out toward the Mississippi, that description is not much of an exaggeration, the qualifier being that the yards surround houses. While the old Creole town of New Roads, originally Point Coupee, across the river from St. Francisville, is a cultural satellite of New Orleans, St. Francisville is more a cultural satellite of the British settled cities of Savannah and Charleston. While rivermen were raising hell in the saloons of Bayou Sarah, the residents of St. Francisville were practicing their Christianity, and the faith of the early British settlers was in the Anglican Church. Grace Church congregation was established in 1827 and served both white and black parishioners. The Gothic Revival style church you see in the photo was opened to worship in 1858. It was built under the church leadership of Bishop Leonidas Polk of the Louisiana Diocese. Bishop Polk became known as the Fighting Bishop when he became a lieutenant general in the Confederate Army. Bishop Polk distinguished himself at Shiloh, later lost his life in the Atlanta campaign. The beautiful trees surrounding the church are live oaks. Live oaks are broad-leafed evergreens and are native to South Louisiana below the 31st parallel of latitude, which separates the Florida parishes from Mississippi. They were found to be such beautiful and effective shade trees. They surround many of the historic homes of Louisiana, even those north of the 31st parallel. They worked so well in the south that seeds and saplings were transferred north. When I took this photo, it was a day following a rain. The evidence of this is the green fern growing on the limbs of the beautiful live oaks. When there's very little moisture in the air, that fern turns brown and shrivels up. You'd think there's no way that plant could be alive. But when rain falls upon the tree, the fern suddenly becomes lush and green. It's called resurrection fern. The gray hair-like wisps hanging from the tree are clusters of Spanish moss. Spanish moss is an epiphyte, absorbing its nutrients and water from the air and rain. There are two components of Spanish moss, one being a long hair-like strand resembling a horsehair. The other is a spongy outer coating that serves the purpose that leaves do on most plants. The horsehair-like strand was used for stuffing car seats and was an important part of construction, which I will tell you about later. The Grace Episcopal graveyard tells a lot of history in the stones marking the graves. If you've heard bad things about the Barra family, they were talking about the Barras from Texas. The Barras from St. Francisville were a very honorable family. The men were adventurous and always ready to serve their country. One Barra is missing from the family plot. He is interred at Arlington National Cemetery. Robert Barra was a 4-star general and 41-year veteran of the United States Marine Corps.
Barrow was 27th Commandant of the United States Marine Corps. Barrow served in China during World War II, training and equipping Chinese guerrillas in Japanese-occupied central China. Barrow served again in Korea in the Incheon Sul and Chosin Reservoir campaigns. Commanding the 9th Marines, he saw combat near the DMZ, Khe Sanh, De Krong Valley, and Ao Shao Valley in Vietnam. In Barrow's time in combat, he earned the Navy Cross, Army Distinguished Service Cross, Defense Distinguished Service Medal with 1 oak leaf cluster, Navy Distinguished Service Medal, Army Distinguished Service Medal, Silver Star Medal, Legion of Merit with 2 5/16 gold stars, and Combat V, Bronze Star Medal with 1 5/16 gold star, and Combat V, and numerous citations, commendations, and campaign medals. Barrow grew up on Rosalie Plantation near St. Francisville during the Great Depression. The tomb of Captain John Elliott Hart tells a story about antagonists setting aside their differences for one day to honor the dead. It also is a story of illness and mental anguish. Captain Hart was commander of the gunboat Albatross, one of 2 boats out of 7 that managed to run past the guns of Port Hudson on the day before America's longest siege in history began. Surviving the bombardment from the guns at Port Hudson, Admiral Farragut's flagship, the Hartford, and the Albatross under Captain Hart's command traveled upstream to engage in blockade duty at the pass to the Red River, where so much food, war material, men, and horses were coming in from Texas. On June 11, 1863, a shot was heard aboard the Albatross. When the crew responded, they found Captain Hart lying on the deck with a mortal wound to his head. A note was found stating that he had suffered far too long from dyspepsia. The note stated it was his wishes to have a Masonic funeral. Not having a metal casket to contain the body for a journey home, the ship's surgeon went to the shore at Bayou Sarah to make arrangements for burial on land. The ship's surgeon was a Mason, and ashore he found Lodge brothers to help him carry out the captain's wishes. Feliciana Lodge number 31 was on the hill in St. Francisville. Walter Leake, a Confederate cavalry officer at home on leave, took it upon himself to make sure a fellow Mason was given a proper burial. For one day the war stopped in the towns of Bayou Sarah and St. Francisville, while the captain's body was delivered to the shore and carried up the hill to Grace Episcopal Church graveyard. Union and Confederate Masons both participated in the funeral. The event is reenacted every year, with Masons from Hart's hometown of Schenectady, New York, coming down to participate, and many types of festivities take place that day, commemorating the day the war stopped. The United Methodist Church congregation started in a church building in Bayou Sarah in 1844. The original church house was popular when the town was hit by floods. The church had upstairs galleries that seated dozens of slaves on Sunday and many families caught in floodwaters. The present church house was built in 1899 after floods had left the Bayou Sarah Church in a state of disrepair. Beside the United Methodist Church is the Robb House, which was built in 1895. It was originally a pharmacy with upstairs living quarters. It now serves as office space and Sunday school classrooms. The new church house has no galleries. Segregation was the legacy of the American Civil War, and afterwards blacks attended their own churches. Only the bell tower and the steeple were part of the original Bayou Sara Church. In 1893, Mount Carmel Catholic Church was built using plans drawn up by Confederate General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, a New Orleans Creole who made history by ordering the artillery bombardment of Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, setting off the Civil War. Many Germans settled Bayou Sara in the early days, establishing mercantile and hotel businesses. Many of the Germans were Jewish. Following the Civil War, many Jews came to the South and provided financing in communities where banks had closed due to lack of capital following the war. St. Francisville was one of those towns. The first Jewish congregation met briefly in the Meyer Hotel before meeting regularly at Julius Freehand's Opera House in Bayou Sara. In 1901, the Temple Sinai was incorporated, naming livery stable owner Ben Mann as congregation president. Work began on the temple in 1902. Shade Tree, a bed and breakfast, sits on 4 wooded acres and offers privacy and a closeness with nature. The buildings were pulled up the hill from Bayou Sara. Hillcroft was built in 1905 as a wedding gift from a brother to his sister and her new husband. It was built in a neoclassical style with a cupola and a widow's walk, and only cost the brother, a wealthy sugar producer, $5,000. Prospect was built around 1805 and was constructed using bousillage. Bousillage is a material the French of Louisiana had learned to make from the regional Indians who used it in the construction of their wattle and daub houses. It is a mixture of clay, animal hair, and that horsehair-like strand from Spanish moss, which I mentioned earlier, packed between posts made from heartwood cypress. Cypress heartwood is rich in tannic acid. Termites can't eat it. As long as it does not touch the ground, it won't rot and will pretty much last forever. Louisiana had an abundance of virgin cypress during its early settlement. Heartwood cypress is the reason we have so many architectural treasures in our region today. Built in the 1890s, St. Reine was named for a French fort and trading post at the village of the Tunica Indians. It was the home of a riverboat captain. Printer's Cottage is a bed and breakfast. There's a legend that under Spanish rule, it was used to house bodies that would be buried in the Spanish cemetery. It was shelled during the Civil War. The St. Francisville Democrat is a newspaper established in 1892 when it was typical for papers to declare their political bias. It is the official journal of record for West Feliciana Parish. Propinquity, a name meaning to be close to someone, was the home of John Mills, the founder of Bayou Sara. The home was built in 1809. It's in a Spanish colonial style and has a full cellar. Lowest soils, being deep and well drained, are the only soils in the Deep South desirable for cellar construction. The ground floor was a store, and the top story was a dwelling. Serendipity was built in 1895 and is a doubled gallery frame house with fish scale shingles, typical of the Queen Anne style houses of the Victorian period. Have you ever wondered what the difference was between galleries and balconies? Galleries are supported from underneath. Balconies extend outward from the structure with no underneath support. The Cabildo was built in 1809. Cabildo is Spanish for seat of local government. Its term as seat of local government for the Spanish was short-lived. for the West Florida Rebellion took place in 1810. It became West Feliciana Parish Courthouse in 1824. The first bank in St. Francisville was built in 1905. Prior to that, banking took place down the hill in Bayou Sarah. It is now Grandmother's Buttons, a cottage industry employing approximately 20 ladies. Their product is jewelry made from antique buttons. Their jewelry is shipped far and wide. The domed roof courthouse was built in 1903 to replace the 1862 building that was damaged by shelling during the Civil War. On the courthouse lawn is an endangered piece of artwork. The monument reads, "In memory of West Feliciana Confederate dead, wherever at rest, Company C, 1st Regiment, Louisiana Cavalry." The law office across the street from the courthouse has been devoted to the practice of the law since 1842. Virginia, built in 1817, was originally a one-room store. In 1855, a Massachusetts lawyer named L.D. Brewer remodeled it to its present state. Brewer only enjoyed the house 4 years before losing his life in a steamboat explosion. The Queen Anne Revival-style Goldson House was built in 1885 by a young Alabama lawyer involved in post-Reconstruction politics. He was a very popular politician. He never lost an election. The home became a residence for retired rectors of Grace Church. Seabrook was built in 1817. It was originally the home of a Baltimore merchant. Old Market Hall was an open-air market used by truck farmers and fishermen to sell their produce. The building was built in 1817. The upper story was the magistrate's office. Having the arched door on the ground level allowed covered wagons to be pulled into the market floor. There consumers bought fresh produce right off the wagon. The market floor was enclosed in 1868. White's Cottage was built in 1903 and is an urban adaptation of a dog trot house. Southern dog trot houses had open-air hallways dividing the house into two parts. The hallway, or dog trot, for that is where the dog stayed cool, was positioned so that it would funnel cool breezes. In the morning, one found shade on the west porch. In the evening, shade was found on the east porch. And when the sun was bearing down from directly above, shade was found in the dog trot. There are quite a few dog trots still standing today, but most people don't realize they are dog trots. That's because the dog trot was enclosed on each end, making it part of the interior of the house. There are several historic plantations in the St. Francisville vicinity that are open to the public, but the one that has been my favorite since my youth is Oakley Plantation. The plantation home was built in 1799 by Ruff and Gray, but the resident of the home that would become the most internationally recognized for many generations to come was nothing more than an itinerant tutor. In 1821, a Frenchman came to Oakley to tutor Eliza Peary, the daughter of the plantation's owner at the time. The tutor taught her music, art, French, and arithmetic in the mornings, and in the afternoon he hunted bird specimens to mount and paint in a natural setting. Still color photography wasn't available at the time. The name of the artist and naturalist was John James Audubon. It was at Oakley Plantation that Audubon completed 32 paintings that would become part of his work, Birds of America. On a rainy winter day, I returned to Oakley for the first time in 4 decades to see living historians from the Civil War period demonstrate the life of a Civil War soldier. The outdoor activities were canceled. but the dancers and musicians showed up. I'm going to close out this video with a performance by the West Feliciana Vintage Dancers. Thank you very much for taking a trip back in time with me to the most historically well-preserved town in Louisiana. The main sources for information for this video were Bayou Sarah Used to Be by Ann Butler and Helen Williams, Images of America, St. Francisville and West Feliciana Parish by Ann Butler and Norman C. Faraci, Civil War, Baton Rouge, Port Hudson, and Bayou Sarah by Dennis J. Dufresne.